So kind of really, I've done a lot of Maltese. Kind of
See if he's got a copy of
and also, there's so much like surrounding.
Yeah.
For me, it's like, you know what? Yeah. Stuff around.
So maybe usually stuff on stories.
I just want to check you were waiting on me.
I'll miss the trip there.
Yeah, let's see.
Yeah, that's okay.
I was wondering if we want to turn off those lights and see if they're better. I don't have to do it. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to just plunge everyone to darkness. Sorry, I didn't mean to rush it. I was just trying to so you could see the more contrast.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome, as always, the Queen's for our lecture this evening. Just go through the usual housekeeping, which I'm sure you're tired of hearing, has to be done. Fire exits to the top there, and then to the bottom here, and the if there is any problem, which you're not expecting, if you could gather in the car park at the front of the building. Could you also please sign the sign-in sheet so we know how many people we've got in here? Just being circulated there, so if you do that, that'd be great. If you could turn off mobile phones, please. Also, if people online, you're also very welcome. If they could also please make sure that you're on mute. We don't want any unnecessary interruptions. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Rob Barrett. Rob studied archaeology originally at Cardiff and then in Cambridge. And after he did his master's there, we were lucky to get him over to Belfast, where he completed his PhD in 2021. He's currently a lecturer here at Queen's in archaeology. He works in the field of digital archaeology, primarily with 3D reconstruction and simulation. He's researched widely in this area and developed digital tools built specifically for archaeology. Much of the work he's done has involved the Neolithic Maltese temples, and he also has been studying on astronomical alignments and structural integrity. And he's also involved in the Ballinhatty project and produced the super reconstruction diagrams that are in Barry Hartwell's books. I'm sure quite a lot of you have probably seen those. So he's also written many papers on the subject of 3D reconstruction and databases. And I met Rob originally on the dig up at Castlereagh during the summer, where he was in charge of all us adult and children volunteers. So good for him for putting up with our amateurish attempts at archaeology, but it was all good anyway. So without further ado, I'd just like to welcome Rob and say thanks very much indeed for coming to talk to us.
All righty, thank you very much for that introduction. I can say first of all that the adults were a lot better than the children as volunteers, which comes as a surprise to everyone, I know. Hello everyone. As we introduced, my name is Rob Barrett. Today I'm going to be showing you a bit of the history of Neolithic Malta. And we're going to be focusing on two different things: the current interpretations, right? What we currently know about these temples. And this is based on a lot of research by lots of very interesting people. But I also want to introduce some new data, some new ideas that I've been working with throughout my MPhil, PhD, and after PhD as well. So we'll be looking a bit at that astronomical alignment and that structural integrity as well later on in the lecture. But I'm going to presume that some of you may know a bit about Malta, some of you may not know anything about Malta. So I'm going to kind of give a bit of a more general view at the start and then kind of go more specific as we go on. So, one second, next slide. Nope, not working. There we go. For those that don't know, in Malta, we have a very important thriving culture in the Neolithic. And this is characterized by the building of enormous megalithic structures that are commonly referred to as temples. Although these temples are impressive and very large, the exact use is not necessarily known to us. We have lots of ideas. As I said, there's current interpretations of what happened in these places. We'll be seeing some of those today, as well as some more historical interpretations of these temple structures. And we're also going to look at other parts of the Maltese culture as well, burial structures, such as the hypogeum in the image right now. And we're going to be looking a bit at the history of Malta, how we got to this point where they were building these big structures, and then looking at how this eventually came to collapse at the end. Or is it a collapse? So that's kind of the overview of today. Just to kind of contextualize what we're talking about, if you don't know where Malta is, it's kind of right in the middle of the Mediterranean, just as those images suggest. It's composed of two primary islands, Malta and Gozo, and there's a small island in the middle called Communal, so there's some other smaller islands there. It's quite a small area, all considered. It's not a very large place, so it's very impressive that such a complex culture developed in such a confined environment. Historically, the time period we talk about the Neolithic in general, but the first occupation in Malta comes down to about 6000 BC. And we have various phases. We've got the Gardalam, Scorba. We'll be looking a bit at what happened in these phases at the start. And then the main kind of temple period, as it's known, the main moment when this culture kind of explodes, tends to be between 3800, 3600, depending on which temples you look at, all the way to about 2500 BC. After which we have a definitive break in the culture and in the archaeological record. Stuff changes at this point, and we will see exactly what happens that leads to this evolution. But starting off kind of with the early days of Malta. So as I said earlier, the first kind of occupation of Malta is kind of dated to around 6000 to about 5500 BC, roughly in that kind of ballpark. There's some recent dates from the Fragsus project that seem to suggest that it definitely would be earlier than this. And this kind of fits with the movement of people that was happening at the time. I'm sure you're familiar with the Neolithic Revolution. So you've got obviously the Danubian route of people traveling up towards the north of Europe. But at the same time, you've got the Mediterranean route where people are traveling across towards Spain, starting off with Crete and Greece and then Italy. And throughout this process, again, from kind of Sicily, at least that's kind of where we think it's come from, people have moved across all the way to Malta. And that connection between Sicily and Malta is something that does appear throughout Maltese history, especially in earlier phases. There seems to be a really strong link between the two. Later on, this link is definitely weakened, but it's still there, it's still existent. So the first kind of phase that we talk about in Malta is the Gardalam phase, which runs from about 6000 to about 5400 BC. And we don't have a lot of evidence from this time period. This was probably quite, a small transition. There wasn't like a massive exodus of people coming. We do have some evidence, however, the main one being the Gardalam cave, which is this cave structure you can see here, which dates around 5400 BC and has various remains, potential domestic activity. We're not talking about ritual activity or burials. And There's pottery that's recovered from this cave system, and this is very similar to pottery you find back in Sicily, which again shows that there's a strong connection between these two areas. It's especially similar to the Centinello pottery that they've got over there, and it's kind of this I think it's called etched ware, I think. So yeah, so there's clear link between the two at this point. Moving slightly forward, we've got the Scorba phase, which runs from about 5,400 to 4,800 BC. And this is named after the site of Scorba, which was excavated by David Trump, not the other Trump, David Trump, let's be clear about this, in the 1960s. It does contain like a later temple, which is also very important for the history of Malta. But primarily, this phase is not about the temples here. It's more about the structures next to the temples. So you can see that in our image, you've got A and B. Those are earlier structures upon which the temples have then been built. And these structures are most likely domestic. People are living here. It's a little village, you may say. But there's also evidence that there's maybe more going on. There's potential shrine happening in one of these rooms. It's a different shape than the other rooms. So it seems like they are starting to become a more complex society by this point, but we don't see any temple building just yet. But the other important thing that you may also notice is that this also shows continuity in sites in Malta. This is something we do see at other sites as well, where you originally have some occupation at the site, and then later on a temple is built on that site, maybe another temple later on even. They do like to reuse the same space over and over again. So this potential shrine may symbolize the start of actual ritual activity happening in this location. At the same time, or just a bit later, we also start having the first burials in Malta. Now, obviously, people did die before now, but we don't have a lot of remains of them. But what we tend to have, especially in this Megar phase, is a series of chambered tombs. The most famous ones are the Shemshir tombs, which one of them is in this image here. And these Shemshir tombs are very interesting because the first tombs, it's got like a single burial, at sites that later on will become mass burial sites, but it tends to be quite small. But there are some tombs in Shemshir that actually have multi-chambers. So they're burying multiple people at the same time. So this is probably to do with family groups. It may be, a family grave for multiple people. But it could also be representative of changes in the society. We're moving away from maybe a more egalitarian society to something where maybe an elite is taking over. And the other reason why these burial sites are important is that there's a suggestion they may have been also a precursor to the temples. So there's this kind of evolution of temples. And there's a suggestion, although obviously it's difficult to kind of prove, that the temples were the original the tombs were the original inspiration for the temple sites. So the Shemshir tomb that you can see up there, you can see the plan of it. It's got, a central area, and it's got these axes, these chambers around it. And then if you look at the earlier temples like Taha Grat, you can definitely see similarities between the two structures. Now, they're not exactly the same. Taha Grat is above ground, while Shemshir is obviously underground. Same with all the other temples, they're all above ground structures. But the similarities are there, and it does suggest that maybe there was a link between these two types of structures, something that we will see a bit later on. There's also important to note that the temples do get more and more complex through time. And you can see here that by the time you get to the Tarshin phase with Tarshin, you have temples with lots of different rooms all over the place. So quite complex buildings. But let's talk about these temples then. So there's around 30, 35, 36 temples that have been excavated. There's others that were potentially there, but maybe have been lost or we have little remains of. And, there's some structures which are a bit disputed, but there's quite a lot of temples. Again, remember, Malta is such a small place. We've got 30 temples all across the islands. As I said, the key phase is around 3,600 to 2,400, possibly 3,800 based on more recent chronology. And you may also notice that we've got clusters of site. We've got, multiple temples within the same kind of area. And if we look at a plan of a typical temple, so to speak, so these are the temples of Gigantia. And their plan is, you know, the most typical temples you can find. You usually have a central corridor, which is, you know, you can see that line going upwards. And you then have apses on the side. So I should also mention, these are two temples next to each other, okay? One is slightly later than the other. So yeah, you've got this central corridor, and then you've got pairs of apses on the side, and then an apse at the end as well, kind of closing it off, yeah? And this is a very classic kind of shape of temple. Sometimes you only get 3 apses, you get 2 on one side, 1 on 2 sides, and then 1 at the end. Sometimes you get up to like 7 or more even. So they can become quite complex, especially later on. Other stuff that you've got, which is very typical, is you've got these very thick outer walls, which have this long and short kind of arrangement, where you've got like a long block, and then you've got a block kind of perpendicular to it. This is a very robust kind of structure. While the interior walls, they're usually made out of megaliths, so large stones usually carved out and placed in this kind of archway kind of pattern. So some examples of this, so we're now moving into the Gigantea phase, when it's kind of the construction of temples really booms. So this is around 3,400 to 2,800 BC. As I said, Gigantea is kind of the classic example, especially on this period. It's why the period's named after it. It's situated on the island of Gozo. And as I said, it was built originally in 3,400, but later on expanded with an additional temple added on. This is something that happens a lot in Maltese temples. They just love to add temples to temples. Now, the Gigantea temples are particular in the sense that their walls aren't actually made out of megaliths. Normally, the interior walls, as I said, would be made out of big megalithic structures. Here we've got large rounded boulders. And I think this also happens in Tagrat. So there's a few sites where this occurs. And there's a suggestion that this is probably due to the fact they're a bit earlier than the other temples. So they were still experimenting with it. They were still trying out different temple structures. And they realized that these rounded cobblestones weren't necessarily the right way forward. And they replaced it with megaliths in later temples. So again, it shows again that there's evolution happening, right? They don't just start building temples and then build exactly the same temple. Temples change through time. And we're talking about thousands of years here, so they've got time to kind of evolve as well. And then kind of compare it to like a temple later on in the period, in around 2,800 to 2,400 BC. You've got the Tarshin phase, which is also named after the Tarshin temples. You've got these ones here. And these are, I mean, not to take away from the builders, they're a bit of a mess, right? There's so much going on with them. You've got 3, potentially 4 temples, one on top of each other, or next to each other, probably more correctly. The central one you access either through the apse of the other temple, and you've got additional entrances. There's a lot going here. It's definitely much more complex than the Gigantea temples that we saw earlier. So it shows that, again, stuff has become more complex, more grand. There's a lot more decorations going on. The stone is a lot more dressed and a lot more precise. So it's definitely an evolution, but it does also symbolize that stuff is getting a lot more complex. And we'll see that that is also reflected in the wider society at the same time. Now, I said I was going to talk about like current interpretations of what happens in these temples. But before I do that, I kind of want to give you a very brief history of his excavation in Malta, because there are obviously, our current understanding of Malta is based on the understanding that people had before this. And the problem with Maltese temples is that we don't have a lot of remains from inside the temples, because most of them were emptied out by the early 1900s. Okay, so temples like Gigantea, Tarshin, I think Tarshin actually was excavated a bit later, but even the ones that kind of survived in the early 1900s, the excavation techniques were not great. So we have a lot of artifacts, but they're all out of context, which obviously for archaeology, it's not great. Now, smaller temples often do have more archaeological remains that are still in situ, but they tend to be less preserved because obviously they're smaller, they've taken up more damage. The Fragsus project recently excavated the Santa Berna temple. So we have some more idea of the stratigraphy there, which is really interesting. So the more temple kind of we find, the more excavations we do, the more information we get. So although, as I said, it is still a work in progress because a lot of information has unfortunately been lost. There's still a lot that we do have, and there's a lot more that we will hopefully have in the future. Now, one of the first kind of belief systems that kind of emerged to do with Neolithic Malta was this idea that the Maltese worshipped the mother goddess. Now, this is a theory that you've heard probably associated with other civilizations. It's something that is a very popular theory, or at least it was a very popular theory in the 1970s. This is, again, one of the earliest interpretations of what was happening in these temples. And it was kind of pushed forward by the discovery of these statues. So we've got these figurines in Malta, which, and again, this is not my terminology, this is how they've been referred to. They're referred to as fat ladies. If anyone has a better word for them, please write a paper, because I don't like doing that. But the point is, you do have these voluptuous figures, and they've been associated again with this figure of the mother goddess. Okay, now this is a theory that we have moved on from. It's not a theory that is something that we accept so much in archaeology, both in Malta and elsewhere, because we do think there's better explanations for what's happening in these places. But it is something that has survived in like local folklore. So if you go and visit Maltese temples, chances are somebody will tell them that they worship the mother goddess. But don't believe them, they're liars. But you can see why this came across. There's some other figurines here, what they look like. So again, you know, if you're looking for a mother goddess, there's plenty of examples of the mother goddess there. There's even a suggestion that the shape of the temples themselves, as you can see in Gigantea, is again of a voluptuous figure. Okay, I don't necessarily see it, but I understand where they're coming from. But again, that is a theory that has been mostly disproven at this point. Now, what we do know about the temples is that there's definitely evidence of ritualistic behavior in these places. So, for example, in Tarshin, there's this altar where, and in kind of the base of it, there's a secret compartment. And in that secret compartment, they found a knife. And behind the altar, they found a lot of animal bones, a whole pile of animal bones. And this has been interpreted, and I think fairly convincingly, that it's something to do with animal sacrifice, potentially feasting. There's various bowls around the place that could have been used to cook animals. There's libation holes in Gigantea, which is slightly disputed, but potentially places where they were pouring liquids into it for, again, cleansing ritual potentially. And there's lots of statues, standing stones, altars, everything kind of suggesting that activities here were in some way ritualistic. I should also say, we definitely know this wasn't a place where the dead were buried. We talk about Hypogea, and I'll go into more into Hypogea in a minute. Temples were definitely not places where bodies were placed or anything like that, and unless we're talking about Tarshin Cemetery, which is in the Bronze Age later on, when there's reuse of the temples, but that's kind of later, not the period we're talking about now. And the other thing that I should also mention is there is also evidence of potential domestic activity in these temples, where they've, for example, got grindstones, so maybe grinding corn together. But primarily, as I said, the most common interpretation is that it's some kind of ritualistic space. And this is also supported by some architectural choices within the temples. So a lot of the megaliths were placed in a certain way that would restrict movement and channel your viewing. So there's these structures called portholes that you can see in the image above, which are kind of almost like doors within the stones themselves. And in order to enter these spaces, you really need to crouch down into them, which meant that, you know, not everyone could get in there. So seeming that they're restricting movement within these spaces. Similarly, at Tarshin, you've got these big megalithic blocks literally blocking the entranceways, right? You can climb over them, so it's not completely blocked, but it is making it less accessible. And the idea is that most likely it's to block access to certain people. So only certain people were allowed into these areas. Other interesting parts of the architecture, for example, in Haga Kim, you've got secret rooms hidden within the walls, which are connected to the main temple with small oracle holes. And the idea is that potentially, and again, this is interpretive, but the idea is that somebody could hide within this area and convey messages from someone, you know, some divine being potentially. So whatever these use spaces were used for, though, it definitely seems like you're restricting movement and you're channeling the view because you're forcing people to look in certain direction, and there's areas that are hidden away as well. When it comes to like decorations, and I'll come to what all of this means in a bit. I want to kind of give you all the evidence first, and then we'll go to exactly what the current interpretations are. But when it comes to decorations, we have, obviously, as I said, these figurines that are pretty prevalent throughout Malta. You also have lots of decorations like these spiral patterns. They're very typical of Maltese archaeology. But you also have other stuff as well, like depictions of animals, for example, which again tend to be in places where potentially this feasting is taking place. So there seems to be a connection there. There's also in the Temple of Bujiba, there's carvings of fish, and there's been interpretations, especially by Ruben Grima, that potentially this iconography is all to do with the sea, and these are waves. The spirals are waves. But you know, it's difficult to kind of say for certain what's happening in these spaces. Now, going to burial spaces a second, because they are connected to what we do, what was happening in the temples. We do also have some really interesting burial spaces in Malta. Burial in Malta tend to take the shape of large underground cave systems that were a lot of time carved out of the rock. And the main site used to be House Eflieni, which was excavated in the early 1900s. Now, unfortunately, the excavator passed away and his notes from his excavation were lost. So we don't have any valuable information of what was found in these places. We know for sure there was at least 8,000 skeletons here. So there was a lot of people being buried in these places. And there's so many bodies that in some areas, the bodies definitely were like several meters tall. So people were, you know, if they were walking around the space, they were definitely walking on the bodies, okay? Which, you know, may seem a bit rough today, but it probably was seen as a positive thing in the past, you know? Now, the fact that obviously there's so many skeletons all buried together, and the fact that the bodies are all kind of mixed together potentially points at an egalitarian society, potentially. And it's linked with this idea of the ancestral pool of people going back to your ancestors when you die. Your body kind of is mixed in with all of your ancestors, which is quite a nice thought, I think. But other stuff from the House Eflieni Hypogeum, the art mimics the above ground temples. I think it's called scalomorphism, if you want a long word of the day. And it shows that there's a link between the spaces of the living and the spaces of the dead, because they seem to kind of mirror each other in some ways. The iconography has got a lot of like classic depictions. For example, the Tree of Life is one that features quite a bit in House Eflieni. And it's very clear that these spaces are also being used for ritual, right? They're and for performances, right? It's not just a space where you put your body in and you run away and you never go back there. People were actively visiting these places, we're actively interacting with these bodies. And there's various works, including some from Dawn Sabina, is looking at actual performances happening in these spaces. There's been studies on the acoustics of the space and how it projects all the way through. So it clearly shows that there's almost like spectacles happening here, and that kind of limiting of the view kind of fits in with that as well, because it's almost like you have a stage and everyone's looking at you, I guess. I get that. The other site that is very important for these hypogeums, these underground cave structures where they bury the dead, is the Shara Broctov Circle. This was something that was excavated in 1987 to 1994, but only published in 2009 by Malone et al. It's a fantastic site. It contains many thousands of human remains, the important thing is that when it was excavated, it was recorded with GIS. So we have a very clear understanding of the stratigraphy. We understand exactly where all the bones were and how they were placed, even today. So it's a very big pool of information. So what was happening in these spaces, and there's kind of almost like an artistic representation of it there, is it seems like human remains were brought down into these spaces and were left to decompose in areas of high visibility. They were being placed and put on display almost. Once the bodies had, rotted away, various parts of that body would be removed and taken into different areas of this cave system. You know, it wasn't like completely clear exactly which space was which, but some areas had more bones, more specific bones than others. And again, this kind of possibly links back with this idea of an ancestral pool. When you die, you lose your individuality and you just become part of all these ancestors. So when people come and visit you after you're dead, they don't just come and visit you, they come and visit everyone who's come before them, which again builds a very strong sense of community. And that's something that's very clear in Malta, that people were they felt united in these places. You also have other stuff happening here. You've got stone bowls, which point to potential like cleansing rituals. Both the Shraubock Circle and the House of Abugino have these big stone bowls. You also had some figurines, and these were found specifically near these portholes, which again suggests that potentially they are ways of gaining access to specific areas. Yeah, you pay your tribute and you get to access certain areas. So you're limiting again movement across here. Now, before I do this, I was actually going to show you something, if this is going to work. I'm sure it's not, but we're going to try it. So I've actually got this thing here. So this is a 3D model that I made of the site. And I'm just going to show you, it's going to start in a minute. And it's basically just a little walkthrough of a reconstruction of what this site used to look like in the past. It's something I did about, probably close to 6-7 years ago. So don't judge the graphics. But you can see, like, you enter this space and this is what you would feel like. We've done this with VR as well, and you can actually hear the sounds of the caves, the acoustics really playing into it. And it's a completely different experience than just kind of visiting above ground. And you can see all of these different bodies. And yeah, if you wanted to walk around here, you would be walking on these bodies. And again, that's not seen as a symbol of disrespect in any way. It probably is actually a symbol of respect for the individuals that were here. So yeah, so that's kind of just a quick view of that model. So let me just resume where I was 1 second. Yeah. Slideshow. Yeah. Work. Okay, I can do it from here. That's fine. So the other thing about, so yeah. There we go. The other work that I've done on this particular site, and again, kind of going back to that visibility idea, the idea that potentially certain areas were being blocked off and that maybe affected what people were seeing in a way that maybe enhanced the performance of the area. Something I did was, together with my colleague, Owen Parkinson, we did this work where I wrote a piece of code that basically looked at the visibility within this space. So what you can see here is the effect of using certain screens to block view. So something that they definitely were doing was using these big megaliths that were being placed and removed whenever they wanted to block access to certain areas or block view to certain areas. And if you look at image B, that's an image of the site when the block isn't there, when that screen is not in place. And you can see that you almost have like a corridor of visibility. I know this is going to be tricky for me to explain without a stick or something. But if you look at the kind of, it's almost like a corridor of light, but that's actually just visibility going from that center circle all the way towards the right. So it's a very highly visible area. But as soon as you put that screen in image A, you see the orange thing there, and there's evidence of that screen being there. That whole area becomes not invisible, but is much less visible than if you don't have that screen, which again is suggesting they are actively blocking the view for whatever reason, whatever they're doing there, they don't want somebody to see it. And they're going to the length of moving enormous megaliths just to do that. So it's a very interesting kind of view on what's happening in these spaces. Now, to kind of bring it all together, I want to kind of go of what all of this means. Basically, just checking, do people see this thing here, or do they see this? They can see that. Cool, just check it, because I tabbed out and then that's kind of caused problems here, but that's all good. So these are kind of all the evidence that we have, and obviously we created our theories based on all of this evidence. And the one thing that is obvious, as I said, is that there's a careful control of interior space happening in Malta. Certain individuals can go in only in certain areas, and they're being blocked off by these portals, these megaliths, these screens for some reason, not everyone has access to these places. There's a suggestion that potentially there's what's been defined as a priestly elite, a group of people who manage the temples, who have access to all these secret areas that other people can't get into. And that fits in with the idea of these sites as almost administrative centers, okay? We talked earlier about how there's various symbols of like grindstones, for example, which would suggest that goods, like food, were being brought here and were being processed in these sites. And that possibly suggests that there's a control of these resources that are then given out to people. And that would be managed by potentially this priest elite or just by an administrator, but there's definitely somebody in charge who would probably have access to the rest of the temple. Oh, no, okay. There we go, yeah, cool. So also the statues of these kind of voluptuous figures also can be reinterpreted as a symbol of prosperity and abundance. The idea that because agriculture was so essential in Malta, because obviously it's a small island, and we'll see in a second the problems that kind of brings to the society, it suggests that people were potentially not in poverty, but they definitely, food may have been a bit scarce, and therefore they may have looked up to these figures as potential ambitions of what they wanted, of this abundance and prosperity that maybe they weren't getting in life. There's also suggestion, as I said, of trade happening in these spaces because, again, of all these resources being brought in. So these also may have been, again, administrative centers in the sense that there may have been trade happening. And something that kind of ties in with all of this is the idea that the control of space becomes more extreme the more time goes on. So by 2400 BC, by the end of the temple period, we have temples such as Tarshin, which are much more complex and where this limiting movement is much more significant. Lots more secret areas, lots more areas blocked off. And this is potentially a symbol of wider trouble happening throughout the island. As I said, agriculture is very important. And something that the Fragsus project has highlighted is that there's environmental changes happening around this time, both in the Mediterranean in general, but also specifically Malta. We have soil degradation. At this point, it's at its peak. People have just intensively cultivated to get everything out of the land. And the more they do that, the more the soil becomes poor in nutrients, which obviously causes less yield. And this is something that is evidenced, for example, by terracing, which Jeremy over there studied. There he is. And again, it shows that potentially stuff is changing at this point and agriculture is becoming much more of an issue. And with that, there's a lot more strain on society and people are becoming more complex, but also more fearful of what's happening. And it all kind of culminates around 2400 BC, where you have intentional iconoclasm, where people are intentionally breaking statues, including this statue here, which shows a definite break with tradition. There's definitely a change happening at this point. Temple sites are abandoned at this point as well. And when you eventually have reuse in the Tarshin cemetery phase, it's for burial practices, so completely different from what was happening before. Now, this isn't necessarily an influx of new people arriving or everyone abandoning the island. That's not necessarily what's happening. All we know is that there's a definite change, potentially maybe even a change of people. But yeah, stuff is happening that is making people unhappy, and they have a big break and a big change. And that kind of ends now the Neolithic and the Temple period, and then we move into the Neolithic, in the Bronze Age, which is kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. Now, so that's the history of the temples, but there's other stuff I kind of wanted to show. First of all, I wanted to show you some other kind of important sites, but then also kind of look at some of my more recent research, which hopefully gives you an insight of new ideas that are kind of emerging in the field. First of all, I want to talk about domestic spaces. So domestic spaces, there's not a lot of domestic spaces that remain in Malta, primarily because they tend to be quite feeble and they don't leave a lot of extant remains. So you don't really see a lot on the surface. So it's very difficult to find them. While the temples, you could have like a signpost saying temple here, you couldn't make it any more obvious they are there. The domestic spaces are much more hidden. So until recently, the only site that we had was the Genselem Road house, which this is one of the models for that I made. But in 2014, there was a new excavation at Tachaula in Gozo, which uncovered remains of a house. And there's a lot of like extensive stratigraphy of the reuse of this house. So we do have a better understanding of what people are actually living in. And again, comparison to the temples, it seems like they are much more Spartan, let's say, which again suggests that they're putting a lot of effort into their temples, not so much on outside activity. The other thing I kind of wanted to talk about is astronomical alignments. So this is something that I've worked a lot in my research, and it's, I think, something that a lot of people are interested in. I know archaeoastronomy is something that has a lot of very interesting participants. And in Maltese, there is a lot of literature suggesting potential astronomical alignments with the temples. You can see here this picture of Menadra and Hagakim on the day of the equinoxes. You've got this beautiful alignment all the way across in the temple, which seems to suggest, solar equinoxes, really important. Now, I've actually written some code that can calculate astronomical alignments in the temples to see if there is any patterns of alignments, right? It's a piece of code specifically designed for this purpose. And I'm going to quickly go through what it does, but it is quite technical. So if you do have any questions about it later, I'm happy to answer them, but I don't want to bore you all to death. So I'm going to give you the basic that you need to know to understand the results. But essentially what I did was I took 23 different Maltese temples, which are the ones that are in better shape. And I calculated the position of the sun, the moon, and different stars throughout a year. And then I tried to find if there was an alignment between the temple and those sites. And this is based on the idea that, that Maltese temples actually all have very similar orientation. So this is something that was suggested by Aegis and Ventura. They did some statistical analysis and proved that most Maltese temples point towards the southeast. And you've got all these different orientations. You can see they're all kind of clustered there. And the chance of that happening completely randomly, if you just oriented temples wherever you wanted, the chance of you happening upon that that particular arrangement is highly unlikely. So suggest that there is an ulterior motive for why these temples were built towards those positions, right? And there's obviously suggestion that this may be astronomical. The way it kind of works is, if you think of the temples, you've got like a small image of Gigantea down there. So the temples, obviously, what we're looking at is when you're standing at the back of the temple, which is that position D, and you're looking through the entrance, position C, that's what I said, a very clear corridor, and you can look out and see into the landscape. So if perchance your position A, your sun or your moon or your star, whatever it is within, it forms a straight line between those 3 points, you have an alignment. Now, alignments aren't always 100% precise, so we calculate the difference between an ideal alignment and the actual orientation of the temple. So if you look at the second image there, you can see what happens if the temple is slightly off. You end up with a little angle, which I'm calling alpha, and that's the error in your alignments, okay? Something that I can do with the software I run is I can calculate every minute of a year, any year, at any site, and see what alignments occur within that year and how good those alignments are. So I did it for 23 temples, and the reason why I did that was so that we could see if there was patterns of alignment. One temple being coincidentally aligned to something is very likely. 23 of them is much more unlikely. So these are the results for the sun. As you can see, there's not many temples that are aligned to the sun. So the only temple that really has a strong solar alignment is Menadra South, which has a strong equinoctial alignment, which means on the equinox, if you stand at the back of the temple and you look at the entranceway, you'll see the sun rising right in front of you, which is very interesting. However, because obviously out of the 23 temples, only one of them seems to have this alignment, we can't really talk about the sun being important in Neolithic Malta's belief systems, right? Otherwise, all the temples would be. So if there was an interest in the sun, it definitely was like a more minimal kind of interest above other stuff. But the more important thing is Crux, or the Southern Cross, as it's known. So the Southern Cross is a series of 4/5 stars, depending how you see it, which include alpha crux, beta crux, gamma crux, and delta crux. And basically, when you look at the temples in Malta, you have a high incidence of alignments with these sites. You don't necessarily need to know what the numbers mean. Red means there's an alignment. That's all you need to know, okay? So you can see that even throughout the various centuries, that alignment holds quite true, is quite strong. And that's very interesting for several reasons. First of all, Malta relied on the Southern Cross. Potentially, if they're traveling to Sicily, that would be the star you would use for navigation. But also the fact that 9 out of the 23 temples have an alignment with crux is classified as statistically significant, in the sense that it's highly unlikely that would be random. Now, I want to take it with a pinch of salt. I'll explain in a second that this isn't as definitive as it sounds, but it definitely shows that if they were interested in any kind of astronomical alignments, the crux would be the one they would be interested in, okay? The main issue kind of comes by the fact that there's not a lot of evidence of interest in astronomical alignments or astronomy in general in Maltese culture. Pretty much those images there are all the evidence that you could possibly find that there was some kind of interest in them. You can see like A and B, you know, there are potential depictions of the sun, you know. C has these interesting kind of patterns that could be potentially representative of some of those alignments. D, similar, you know, could be interpreted as a ray of the sun hitting the back of the temple. E is another kind of circular stone, which again has been interpreted potentially to be something to do with the rising sun. There's some stones, and that's what F is. That stone there has lots of different tallies on it, which has been interpreted with the rising and setting of the Pleiades. It seems to match quite well with that kind of pattern. G, there's these five holes, which have been interpreted at times as just a game. At other times, somebody has suggested that they have the shape of that crux that we were talking about. So there is some evidence that that could be linked. And H, unfortunately, is not the best picture of it, but that's the Talcadi stone, where you've also got depictions of stars, potentially the moon. So again, that is quite a good piece of evidence of interest in astronomy. What am I doing? Okay, I'm doing good. So the problem again is, you know, when you're looking at archaeological astronomy, it's quite easy to find an alignment, but to prove it is quite difficult, right? You need to show that they were intentionally wanting to align to certain things. And there's not a lot of evidence in the archaeology to suggest that they were very interested in astronomical alignments. So, you know, I'm not saying that it can't be the case, just that if it was something that they were really interested in, it doesn't show in the archaeological record. So it's more likely to be a kind of a secondary belief system rather than the primary focus as well. To complicate matters, you also got the addition of confounding variables. So if you were to, like, for example, if the Maltese had decided to orient all their temples downwind or towards the winter sun, for example, you could end up with patterns orientation much more like that instead if you had a random choice, which again suggests that potentially those orientations are a bit less astrological than we think. There may be actual other reasons that explain why that is so. And to kind of prove this, just as a quick kind of aside, I'm currently writing a paper about it, but I run some McDonald's in Barcelona to see if they happen to have astronomical alignments in 3000 BC, and turns out they do. So don't believe any kind of astronomical data unless there's concrete archaeological evidence for it behind it, because unfortunately it is something that confounding variables can really impact your results. So just to kind of conclude that, the idea is, you know, if there is an interest in astronomical alignments in Malta, the crux is the most likely candidate, and it is entirely possible that they were interested in the crux, but we don't know anything for certain because unless we find, you know, somebody's written something about the crux, or suddenly we find a temple dedicated to the crux, it's unlikely we'll know for certain, unfortunately. The other thing that kind of I looked at during my PhD was looking at the roofing of the temples. So as you may have seen from the photos up to now, you may have noticed that most of the temples do not have a roof. And that's because the roof has potentially collapsed, or some argue it was never there. There's various suggestions of what this roof could have looked like. The main argument is that it's made out of stone, and this is based out of stone corbelling. So that image you see there, those rows of stone on top, they would slowly kind of build inwards until you've got these spanning stones on top. So you could have these big stone caps, basically. Alternatively, it's possible it was a wooden roof, and this is kind of suggested by the fact that you've got evidence of burning inside the temples, which, you know, there's such a big fire, it could only really have come from a roof if it was made out of wood. And also the fact that you don't find any of the large megaliths within the temples. So if it was a stone roof and it collapsed, there's no evidence of that collapse happening. There's also potentials, obviously, of being a combination of both, or that potential some temples earlier on were using wood and then later on using stone. There's various ways you can kind of look at it. But one thing I kind of wanted to look at was trying to understand if a stone roof was even possible from a structural point of view. Because it's all well and good to say, oh yes, that temple had a stone roof on it, but when you're dealing with stones which weigh several tons each, well, more than that, you know, they're enormous stones. Is it even possible for the structure to remain standing with all of these stones above it? So the first thing I kind of did was looking at making a little model out of polystyrene, just to kind of test the forces in play, which obviously kind of, it showed that it's possible to maintain the temple upright if you have these stone structures. It is a very stable structure, but it doesn't necessarily give us any indication of those forces in play. So instead I used something called robot structural analysis. Yeah, it's that exciting, I guarantee it. And basically what this is structural engineering software, basically. It's nothing to do with archaeology, but what it does is it calculates the stress in buildings, okay? So what you can see here is, you can see where you have like the light, so the darker blue, that is a structure which is under compressive force. You've got something pushing downwards that is causing it stress. Alternatively, if you've got like, well, very red, you've got a stone which is being pulled away by tensile force. So you see those big slabs on top. When you've got a big slab, that's pushing downwards on itself, and that's causing tension in the middle, okay? So the idea is, if you've got a stone roof like the one kind of depicted in this model, and I realize this is a very simplistic model, but it kind of conveys all the important points. This software can calculate those stresses and those forces that are in play to see what kind of forces are we dealing with. And the results are basically that, sorry, I just went forward. The results are basically that the forces in play are so little compared to the strength of the actual stones being used that there is no danger of the roof collapsing. So it's entirely possible that the stones the roofs could be made out of stone, and there would be no problem structurally for that to happen. It's not necessarily ruling out wood, because obviously that is lighter than stone, so obviously it's the same results. But it does give you some more information on these structures. And this is something you can't necessarily test in real life. You can't rebuild the Maltese temple just to try out these forces. So the fact that we've got these computer softwares that can do it for us gives us a new data, a new insight into archaeological processes that are not possible to be done in real life. So that's what I do. But the other thing also that's very interesting is that when I was kind of looking at these temples and trying to rebuild them in 3D, there's some really interesting architectural features that prove to be crucial for these structures. And there's two specific ones I want to talk about. First of all, there's rubble between the outer wall and the inner wall. So that kind of empty space you've got there, that would have been filled by rubble. And the fact that the outside walls have these like long and shorts that I described earlier, which is a very strong structure, makes you think that they are definitely planning to have a lot of weight on these walls. And that rubble in the middle is essential to essentially act as a barrier for that inner wall, because that inner wall, if you put too much strength on it, it's just going to bow out and basically break, and the whole thing is going to collapse. So that rubble in between the outer wall and the inner wall is fixing those inner walls into place. And the inner walls themselves have a very interesting characteristic in that they are slanted. So if you look at any kind of photo of the Maltese temples, you'll notice the walls aren't vertical, they are slightly slanted inwards. And that's really interesting because it's a very good way of dissipating stress. So if you've got stress coming from above, and you've got like just a straight vertical wall, all the stress is going onto the wall. But if you got it slanted outwards, some of that stress is being dissipated into the ground, okay? And if you add in then the rubble, you've got a very solid structure, okay? So the idea is, why would you build such architectural features unless you are going to make a stone wall? And that's kind of, I think, the conclusion here. You know, you could build it out of wood and that's fine, but then you wouldn't need all these architectural features. These are all kind of additional things that are just used to kind of reinforce the structure. So again, it's not conclusive. It's not saying necessarily it has to be stone walls or all the temples were stone, but it does show that there is some evidence for them to be that way, just in the architecture alone. And the other thing that's really interesting, it kind of also shines a light on what else is happening in Malta as well. Because Malta, as you said, is quite a small area, but there's always been various interpretations of what's happening at a more regional level, right? Originally, you know, you've had Renfrew's idea that potentially this was to do with different chiefdoms. So you have different areas, and each one of them was administered by a chief, and they were all at war with one another. And these clusters of temples were the center point of these different chiefdoms. But really, what kind of this evidence is showing is that that's probably not the case, because if they've got these really interesting architectural features, and even like the alignment stuff, it does show that they're capable of building really precise temples with really precise orientations. All these features kind of suggest that there is information being moved around, right? This idea of cultural diffusion, which we talk about in archaeology, ideas are moving between people. And this happens both vertically, in the sense that people need to transmit it down to future generations. And that potentially represents people having jobs that are specifically to do with that, right? You have, you know, an architect who plans the temple and has that knowledge of how to build a temple. And you know, that also suggests that these temples were administrative centers, because if you are an architect, you're not in a field getting food for yourself. So somebody needs to give you that food. So these temples are redistributing that food. But also it represents horizontal cultural transmission, where people are moving across the island and transmitting these ideas from one place to another. There's so much similarities between these temples that it's impossible that all these people came up with the same concepts by themselves. They must have been communicating between one another, which again points to a society that is a lot more, you know, united than what maybe previously was thought. So yeah, so that kind of gives you a good idea of what's happening. So that's pretty much where I'm going to end it. I think that's been mostly an hour, basically, but hopefully that gives you a good idea of what was happening in Malta during the temple period, why we've got these temples, what they were being used for. Same with Hypogea. And also it's a bit of an insight in some of the new data that we're working on at the moment. Both myself, the Fragsus project, recently produced 3-4 monographs, which are definitely worth reading if you're interested in Malta. There's some really good, interesting information about new sites that have been discovered, new chronologies, all really interesting stuff. So it's an area that is still evolving and new things are being discovered, which makes it incredibly interesting in many ways. But that is everything from me. Oh God, everything's got set up for me as well. I'm going to try and turn on the lights. Oh, yeah, okay, we did that. Thank you. Let's do this so that we can see. There you go. Cool.
Thank you, Rob, so much indeed. I think that
was
absolutely wonderful to romp through. Gave me very happy memories of our UAS study tour to Malta in 2015. People here were on. But it certainly has given us a lot more to think about. I mean, even in those few years, really, I think it is always worth having a new look.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
At places, and thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you so much indeed.
Pleasure.
Would you be willing to take questions?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, if anybody's got any questions, happy to answer.
Right, anybody like to start off? Please.
Just a couple of points, and thank you very much for that presentation.
Yes.
You mentioned links to Sicily, obviously the newest part. I looked to it at the beginning and occasionally in the lecture. And I just wondered, are there any other parallels to this in Sicily? Or are there any parallels that strike you in other contemporary parts of Mediterranean.
So the connection to Sicily is something I didn't really talk too much about because there's so much to discuss. Throughout the Temple period, there is definitely some connection still happening with Sicily, and especially obsidian being moved around, all the Mediterranean, but also Malta. But that connection is much weaker later on. They don't seem to be communicating so much. But there's not anything that is exactly like this anywhere else. There is suggestions that there are later sites that maybe are connected to it, stuff like the Toloi, I think they're called, in Mycenae, which are burial structures which have similar kind of corbelled roof going upwards. There has been links drawn between the two, but I think Mycenae is, oh God, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it's about 1000 BC, something like that. So it's much later. The Nuraghi in Sardinia also, some people have kind of associated the two, again, though much later. So again, it does seem to be quite unique to Malta. It's not something that's traveled. And in Sicily itself, you don't see any kind of megalithic structures. You know, you see similarities, pottery, especially early on, but these structures seem to be unique to Malta as far as we can tell. Nice.
Yeah, this is sort of what you describe really as the display area, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Recent, well, not burials, but recent, whatever they were doing. All those bones that were discovered, has there been anything work done on the bones themselves to sort of look at how the bodies were treated, where they be fleshed outside, brought in? You know, any evidence from the bones that would
yeah. I'm trying to think back to various excavations. I know Owen Parkinson has done his PhD was looking at the human remains from the Shah-Abrokhtov Circle, but he was analysing more. I think it was mostly to do with the stress of temple building and see if there was any evidence of them in the bones. So it was more to do with ante-mortem rather than post-mortem. I don't know off the top of my head if much work has been done. Oh, sorry, Jeremy can answer that. There you go.
I can answer that.
There you go, Jeremy.
There's been a PhD done on it. Essentially, human remains are brought in, and the individuals are so carefully taken apart that it doesn't leave any stress markers on the bones, which is incredibly difficult to do. No sign of defleshing, cutting, no sign of tendons being pulled from the bone. So they're as intact a set of remains as you can imagine, which I think that it's very difficult to answer how that was achieved. Because if you're using flint or obsidian to take your long bones off, for example, you're going to leave cut marks, but there's no cut marks. If you're pulling them apart as they have become a little bit more fermented, right, then you're going to be pulling little bits of bone off with what remains of the tendons. And what's seen from the Shah-Abrokhtov circle is that there's not that evidence for the act of separation, yet the remains have been separated and they're split into skulls and long bones in one area and other bones in other areas. So I think it's maybe what you were saying about the ancestral pool.
Yeah.
The sense of
intermingling
carries through after death, but that thesis, which is freely available online, I think points to the fact that it's just a continual renegotiation with death.
Yeah.
So it's something fairly unique.
They're brought in crouched into the display zones.
I should say that's Dr. Jeremy Bennett, who also excavated in Malta when I was there, and has also done much work in Malta as well. So I've got support as well, just in case.
Where are the bones now?
Where are the bones now? Do you know, Jeremy? I don't actually know. They used to be, I remember they used to be in Gigantia, weren't they? They were like in a shack there, but I don't know.
That was my very first experience of Malta, was with Caroline.
Yeah.
They've been moved to the National Museum in Malta. Okay. The hypogeum there that you've showed, those bones were crushed and placed on the fields when it was excavated. So I think there's the remains of about 700 individuals from Gozo. Yeah,
on the Shah-Abrokhtov Circle, which is why it's such an important site. Yeah, no, for a while they were unfortunately held just in a shack in the Gigantia area. There was like a little area next to the site, but they weren't publicly accessible. But it's good to know that they're now at the museum. Yeah.
Why did the burial practice change after 2400 BC?
Why did they change?
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, society definitely had a whole, there was a whole change of society. They broke all of the statues they had before. They abandoned the temples for a while. So whatever happened, as I said, it's probably like both internal pressure, maybe a bit of external pressure because of climate, really put a strain on the society to the point where they just decided we've had enough. We're going to change everything. So past that date, the only evidence, well, no, we have a lot of evidence, but the Tarshian cemetery phase we talk about is when they were cremating skeletons and they were placing them within the temples. Primarily Tarshian was being used for that. So it's, again, it shows that there's a completely different system going on here. So it's definitely a break in the continuity at that point and shows that new people or new ideas have been introduced. Oh no, here he goes.
A few observations. I think one that, I mean, I've been looking at Malta for over a decade, and it still strikes me is that you're talking about a set of islands that fit inside Loch Ness. At best, an average population of around, well, a population that might have only reached about 7,000 people fit into this tiny area. I think, and this will lead on to a question that I have, I think the trappings of what archaeology has done over the past century are getting applied to such a tiny space. And so my question is, where's this idea of a priestly elite coming from?
It's a Stoddart paper from the 1990s, if you need to know. No, I think it's an interesting thing because, you know, obviously we talk about prehistory, we don't have anything in writing, so everything we have to do is analyze the evidence for it. And there is an evidence of an increased complexity later on in the temple period, which comes with an increased secrecy and increasingly screens and blocked off areas, which again suggests that only certain people have access to certain places. I think calling a priestly elite is probably not the most helpful of terms, just as in the term temple is probably not really the most correct word for it. What we're talking is mostly about a group of people who were in control and potentially had some roles within this ritual system. But they weren't, you know, dressed up in priestly robes going around and blessing people. I don't think that's what we're looking at. I think we're just looking at somebody who was, you know, just slightly above everyone else and kind of had access to this kind of whatever divinity idea, belief system they had in this place. So that's probably what was happening. But it is open for interpretation, and interpretation will change through time. So yeah, we'll see what happens. 20 years from now, everyone will say I'm wrong, you know, it's just the way it is.
Could counter that.
Oh dear, here he comes.
Just something I think it's very used at the moment. With how farmers are perceiving being treated with the inheritance tax changes.
Yes.
But Gigantea is a prime example of the megalithic site built on an established field system. Fragsus project showed that on the deeper levels of the deeper strata, to rich, stable agricultural soil, over time, you can see where people start trying to stabilize that soil, manuring practices, whatnot, throwing material out on it. You can see in the soil the destabilization of the agricultural world. Yet somehow Gigantea gets plonked on top. So if you've got power structures in place, but trying to build on top of your farming world.
Yeah, but I think I think it fits in a way, because we talked about how domestic spaces tend to be quite feeble comparison to these sites. You know, these aren't people who are like living in luxury and just go, oh, you know what, I fancy building a temple, right? It's probably part of a response to social struggles or like environmental struggles happening on the island. If people are feeling the pressure because the agriculture is deteriorating and stuff, I mean, what can you do? Yeah, you can try and fix the soil, and maybe that works for a while, maybe that doesn't work for a while. And then you go, right, do you know what? I'm going to build a temple and hope somebody else helps me, you know? So again, you know, we don't want to necessarily impose religious beliefs or anything like that, but I do see an argument for it. I think, you know, these temples aren't necessarily a representation of, you know, a society which is thriving. It's potentially a symbol of a society that is actually already in decline and will continue to be in decline until an eventual collapse about 1,400 years later, whatever it is. So I think it fits that narrative, I think. But it is still a narrative, again, with archaeology, nothing is certain. What's that?
think there were any parallels with the Ness of Brodgar and how it was finally abandoned?
I honestly don't know much about Neolithic, I'm afraid. So I wouldn't be able to say specifically what happened there.
The site
Yeah.
in Scotland
Yeah, no,
on an isthmus,
Mm.
the very final building,
yeah,
it was a beautiful building and they seem to have had a huge feast in it.
Yeah.
And then just abandoned it.
yeah. So something that is important, like I think it's kind of like a natural transition. I mean, I'm talking more generally now because again, I don't necessarily know the site so much and I can speak about details from it. But I was reading a paper recently, kind of, I was running simulations to see if you have like agriculture and intensive agriculture, what happens to that society? And the result is that you have periods of prosperity for a long time, and then quite suddenly around the 100-year mark, it just collapses, right? Now, if you've got a bigger society, more complex society, you can last a lot longer. But the idea that a society can just kind of grow forever is just not something that is applicable, especially when you're at the mercy of agriculture, which can be temperamental. And yes, you can put resources aside to protect yourself, but if you have like 1 bad year, 2 bad year, and your population is growing at the same time, you know, eventually you're going to get to a point where there's going to be a break. And we see this in a lot of different cultures. So though I can't say specifically for Neolithic, it is something that we see in archaeology. It's a pattern of societies getting bigger and bigger and then kind of collapsing. Now, this is probably a bit earlier in the Neolithic with the examples they were doing, but it does kind of apply to a lot of different cultures that you can think of.
Was this quite a stable society? Was there any sort of conflict or anything like within that society? You know, where it broke down at various stages?
As in conflict as in war, you mean?
Anything, any like into sort of warfare between anybody?
No, there wasn't any conflict as far as we can tell. There's no evidence of like massive weaponry or anything like that. Again, you know, we did say, you know, at the end of the temple period, obviously there is the breaking of the sculptures and that kind of stuff. Now, obviously you can interpret that as an internal thing where people have got sick of it and they're just destroying, doing things. It could also be interpreted as someone's come in and raided the place and destroyed stuff, right? I think the former is more likely than the latter, but you know, it's definitely debatable. Of course, you know, there would have been external pressure as well. You know, there are people traveling across the Mediterranean at this time, but there's no concrete evidence of people fighting at this point. It does seem to be a peaceful society, for a better word. Doesn't mean there wasn't, you know, internal struggles, but it didn't seem to be violent as far as we can tell. Especially like in the remains, there doesn't seem to be any kind of widespread evidence of injuries or anything like that that would suggest violence. Yes.
Is there any evidence for environmental damage? You know, I know this was later when Thera, you know, exploded and you got the fall of the Minoan civilization. Was there any evidence of similar type of disaster that might have contributed to agriculture failing, for example?
The main evidence for it, and especially like this is something that's covered in the Fragsus books, is that there is environmental change happening at this point. The climate has a bit of a shift around this time, which would have impacted agriculture at the same time. But the main one is, again, is the soil erosion that probably would have played a major role into it. Because obviously that's what you need for agriculture, you need good soil, and if you're just kind of intensively cultivating it, that is actually going to give rid of a lot of the nutrients, and your yield is going to be much lower. So it's not so much of a, you know, big catastrophic event or anything like that happening. We definitely don't see evidence of that. It's more smaller changes that, you know, have a domino effect, which eventually lead to these issues. It probably would have been also quite a slow process. You know, it's not from one day to the next they wake up and suddenly everything is dead, right? Every year would have been a bit less yield, and coupled with population growth, which definitely is what tends to happen in these societies. You tend to have more and more people. Eventually, the people outweigh the resources, and that's kind of the breaking point. So yeah, not, you know, don't think explosion or something, you know, much more mundane than that. It's all about agriculture at the end. Mm-hmm.
Any last questions? Well, in that case, I just say thank you again very,
Yeah.
very much indeed, Rob.
Oh,
It's
that's a
a
pleasure.
little token of our
Oh, no,
appreciation.
you
Thank
don't have to.
And
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just before we go, our next lecture is on the 16th of December, a little closer to home in Barry Hart. We'll be talking about Cranmore House, just up the road, Malone Road. And hope to see as many of you as possible there. Also, I'd like to put out a last shout for our next foreign trip, which will be to Slovakia in September next year. It still take a few more people, so if you haven't thought about it, if you get in touch with me very, very quickly, if you would like to come along, I'll be welcome. And let me know, but sooner rather than later, because I have to finalize. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi. Okay, yes. I consider it a donation. I consider it a donation. I appreciate the donation. No, it's not. Oh, okay. 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 That's fine. That's fine. Thank you very much. I mean, you got me there. If it was money, you would have had it. No, I appreciate it. Look, I do it. No, I do it out of pleasure. Absolutely. It's never out of. Okay.